San Juan Mountains, Colorado, August 1882. The air at 10,000 feet was thin and sharp, smelling of pine resin and the dust of a summer determined to hold on. Below the jagged peaks, in a small clearing carved out of the wilderness, Matteo Ricci worked. He didn't work like the other men. He wasn't swinging an axe with the rhythmic fury of a logger, nor was he panning for color in the icy creek. He was moving stone. Not small stones for a chimney flue, but massive slate-gray blocks of granite hewn from the cliffside behind his half-finished cabin. Each one weighed hundreds of pounds. Using a simple tripod of stout pine logs, rope, and a series of levers, he nudged and pivoted the colossal stones into place. He was building the cabin's rear wall, the one that would house the hearth, into a solid, seamless mass of rock 3 feet thick. Darius Klein, the mining camp's lead carpenter, stopped on his way to the new bunkhouse site, an axe resting on his shoulder. He watched for a long moment, his face a mask of professional disbelief. Klein was a man who understood the elegant logic of timber framing, of dovetailed joints and pitch-sealed roofs. He knew how to build a structure that could shed a 4-foot snowfall and stand against a winter gale. What Ricci was doing was not logic, it was madness. "That's a month of wasted labor, Ricci," Klein called out, his voice carrying easily in the clear air. 2 other men, Silas Croft and Jedediah Prentice, paused their work to watch the exchange. Klein gestured with his axe toward the meticulously stacked wall. "A man could frame 2 cabins in the time you've spent piling those rocks. It's a fool's work. You'll be heating the entire mountain with a wall that thick," Silas Croft chuckled. "More like the mountain will be freezing his cabin. Stone bleeds heat, everyone knows that." Matteo Ricci paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty hand. He looked at the wall, then at the men. His English was careful, measured. "The stone does not bleed," he said, his voice quiet. "It drinks." He then turned back to his work, fitting a smaller wedge of granite into a gap with the precision of a watchmaker, leaving the carpenters to shake their heads at the strange Italian's crazy idea. What did this Italian stonemason, a man from a world of ancient rock and generational knowledge, understand about the physics of thermal mass, that a lifetime of frontier carpentry, of quick builds and conventional wisdom had completely missed? The answer wouldn't be found in a book of engineering, but in the bitter memory of a freezing child and the deep, slow pulse of a heated stone. If you stick with me through this story of quiet defiance and forgotten science, I promise you will learn the simple, powerful physics of how a rock can become a battery for heat, a silent guardian against the deepest cold. It's a principle that can change the way you think about warmth itself. We work hard to uncover these forgotten stories of ingenuity, and your support helps us continue. Please take a moment to subscribe and click the like button. It truly makes a difference. And let us know in the comments, have you ever felt the warmth coming off a sun-baked rock or a brick wall long after sunset? Tell us about it below. Matteo Ricci was not a logger, not a miner, not a frontiersman. In his former life across an ocean and a continent, he was a muratore, a stonemason from the Valtellina, a steep-sided valley carved through the Italian Alps. He was a man whose hands didn't know the feel of an axe handle as well as they knew the sharp edge of a chisel, the gritty texture of mortar, and the immense patient weight of granite. He had not been raised in a world of abundant timber, but in a world where stone was the bedrock of existence. His people built their lives from it, retaining walls that turned impossible slopes into terraced vineyards, foundations that had stood for 500 years, and the massive tiled masonry heaters, the stews, that sat in the center of their homes like slumbering beasts, radiating a gentle, constant warmth through the longest alpine winters. He had come to America with his wife, Elena, and their two small children, Sophia and Leo, chasing the promise of work in the booming silver mines of the San Juans. He was strong, and he could swing a pickaxe as well as any man, but his heart and his hands belonged to stone. The first winter, 1881, had been their trial by fire, or rather, by its absence. They lived in a hastily constructed board and batten shack, a structure built to the exact specifications of frontier necessity, fast, cheap, and terribly insufficient. It was a wooden box designed to fight the cold with constant battle, a war of attrition they were destined to lose every single night. The experience was seared into Mateo's memory with the clarity of trauma. The fire in their small cast-iron stove, fed with precious hard-won wood, would roar to life, driving them back with its scorching heat. But it was a fleeting, deceptive warmth. It heated only the air, a thin, invisible buffer against the crushing cold outside. By midnight, the fire would have consumed its fuel and died down to a bed of pale embers. The cold would then begin its inexorable seep. It crept through the floorboards, slid through the gaps in the chinking, and radiated from the thin wooden walls. Elena would wake to find frost ramming the edges of their wool bedrolls, her breath a white plume in the darkness. In the morning, the water left in their tin cups on the small table, a mere 6 feet from the stove, was a solid disk of ice. Little Leo had developed a cough that rattled in his chest for 3 months, a sound that terrified Mateo more than any blizzard. That winter, he didn't just feel the cold. He understood it as an active, predatory force. He swore he would not let his family suffer through another season like it. The fundamental failure of the conventional frontier cabin wasn't a matter of poor craftsmanship. Darius Klein was an excellent carpenter. His joints were tight, his roofs were sound. The failure was one of physics. The problem wasn't the fire, the problem was the house's inability to remember the fire. A standard log or timber frame cabin is a structure of low thermal mass. Wood is a decent insulator, far better than stone, in fact, at resisting the initial transfer of heat, but it is light. It has very little density. It cannot absorb and store significant amounts of thermal energy. The cycle of life in the Croft family's cabin, a well-built structure just down the path, was a perfect example of this thermodynamic flaw. In the evening, Silas would stoke the stove until it glowed cherry red. The air inside would become warm, even hot. But the log walls themselves, despite being inches from the heated interior, remained cold to the touch. Their mass was insufficient to act as a heat sink. The moment the fire began to die, the cabin's interior began a rapid march toward equilibrium with the outside temperature. The meager warmth stored in the wooden walls and the air itself would radiate outward into the -20-degree night. The family would huddle under a mountain of quilts, waking every few hours to the chilling realization that the fire was out again. They were burning through their woodpile at a terrifying rate, engaged in a constant, exhausting, and ultimately losing battle. They were pouring heat into a bucket with a large hole in its bottom. The warmth was there one moment and gone the next, lost forever to the vast, cold emptiness of the mountains. Mateo knew he couldn't patch the hole. He had to build a different kind of bucket. As summer waned and the aspen leaves began to turn a brilliant, heartbreaking gold, Mateo's project became a source of quiet amusement and open debate in the small community. His cabin was taking shape, but it was unlike any other. The front and side walls were timber-framed, standard construction he'd managed with salvaged and second-rate wood. But the rear wall, the soul of the structure, was his granite monolith. 8 feet high, 10 feet wide, and a solid 3 feet deep. He had quarried, shaped, and laid over 20 tons of solid rock with the help of little more than leverage and his own 2 hands. The conflict with Darius Klein had come to a head in September. Mateo had exhausted his supply of decent timber and approached the carpenter to trade his labor, offering to dig foundations for the new bunkhouse, in exchange for seasoned pine logs to finish his roof and floors. Klein stood with his arms crossed, looking at the massive, almost pagan-looking stone wall that dominated Matteo's building site. "I'm not trading good timber for your rock-piling folly," Klein said, his voice flat and final. It wasn't just mockery now, it was business. "You've wasted the best building months on that monument to stubbornness. You'll have no cabin left to heat when the first snow flies. I need my lumber for men who know how to build proper." The intensity of the refusal was a blow. It was an economic blacklisting. The rejection forced Matteo to make difficult compromises. He spent weeks trading his skilled labor for scraps, for green, unseasoned wood that would shrink and check, for discarded offcuts from the mining company's sawmill. The rest of his cabin was built with inferior materials because he had invested everything, his time, his energy, his social capital, into the stone wall that everyone else saw as his greatest mistake. Elena watched him, her heart a knot of anxiety and trust. One evening, as he came inside their temporary shelter, his hands raw and bleeding from the day's work, she touched his arm. "It is a strange wall, Matteo," she said softly, her Italian accent a warm melody against the harsh mountain backdrop. "Klein says it will draw the cold into our house." Matteo took her hands in his. He looked past her, toward the dark, hulking shape of his creation, silhouetted against the rising moon. "No, cara mia," he answered, his voice full of a certainty that defied all local logic. "It is a warm wall. It will remember the fire for us." To understand what Matteo Ricci knew in his bones, you have to understand the principle of thermal mass. It is the ability of a material to absorb, store, and release heat. Think of it like this: a thin metal sheet and a heavy cast iron skillet can both be heated by the same flame. The metal sheet gets hot almost instantly, but the moment you remove the flame, it cools just as fast. The heavy skillet, however, takes a long time to heat up. It absorbs the energy, soaking it deep into its mass. But once it's hot, it stays hot for a long, long time after the flame is gone, radiating that stored energy back out. The skillet has high thermal mass. The sheet metal does not. A frontier cabin was like the thin metal sheet. Matteo's cabin was designed to be the cast iron skillet. Let's look at the numbers, because the physics are not magic. They are mathematics. Heat storage capacity is measured in British thermal units, or BTUs. A pound of granite can store approximately 0.19 BTUs for every degree Fahrenheit its temperature is raised. A pound of pine wood, the material of a standard cabin, actually stores more per pound, about 0.33 BTUs. This is where the skeptic's intuition came from. Stone feels colder and is a poorer insulator than wood. But this comparison is deceptive because it ignores the most critical variable: density. A cubic foot of granite weighs about 168 pounds. A cubic foot of pine weighs only about 25 pounds. Therefore, that cubic foot of granite can store 168 pounds 0.19 British thermal units per pound degree Fahrenheit, equals 31.9 British thermal units per degree. The cubic foot of pine can only store 25 pounds 0.33 BTU per pound degree Fahrenheit, equals 8.25 BTU per degree. The granite has nearly 4 times the heat storage capacity of the pine by volume. Matteo's wall was 10 feet wide, 8 feet high, and 3 feet thick. That's 240 cubic feet of solid granite. Multiplied by its density, that wall contained over 40,000 pounds of stone. It was, in effect, a 40,000-pound thermal battery sitting inside his house. When Matteo lit a fire in the hearth, the heat didn't just go up the chimney or into the room's air. The radiant energy from the flames and the hot gases circulating against the back of the firebox were absorbed directly into that colossal mass of stone. For hours, the wall would drink the heat, as he had said. The surface would get hot, and that heat would slowly, steadily conduct its way deep into the core of the 3-foot-thick wall. Then, when the fire died down, the laws of thermodynamics would reverse. The air in the cabin would begin to cool. Soon, the air would be colder than the surface of the stone wall. Heat always moves from warmer objects to cooler ones. The 40,000-pound wall, now saturated with stored energy, would begin to radiate its warmth back into the living space. It was a slow, gentle, and continuous process. The wall became the fire, a silent, tireless furnace that would run for hours, even days, on the thermal charge of a single, hot burn. It was a revolutionary concept on a frontier that only knew how to fight the cold with the constant, frantic consumption of fuel. The alpine freeze settled over the San Juans in the middle of January. It was not a storm, but a quiet, lethal descent of the atmosphere. For 9 consecutive days, the mercury in the camp's official thermometer never rose above -15 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, it plunged to nearly 30 below. A thin, powerless sun appeared for a few hours each day, its light too weak to offer any warmth. It was the kind of cold that found every crack, that turned drafty cabins into death traps, and that tested the limits of every living thing. In the conventional cabins, life ground to a miserable halt. The families were prisoners in their own homes, engaged in a desperate, round-the-clock struggle for warmth. In Darius Klein's well-built but low-mass cabin, the air was a constant battleground of extremes. To stay warm, he had to keep his stove running so hot that the area within 5 feet of it was scorching, while the far corners of the room remained frigid enough to crystallize one's breath. They burned through a massive amount of wood, the pile he'd thought would last till March dwindling at an alarming rate. They slept in shifts, one person always awake to feed the hungry stove. It was a siege. In the Ricci cabin, life was normal. In the morning, Matteo would build a large, hot fire. He used dense, dry pine, burning it fast and hot for about 3 hours. The stone wall behind the hearth soaked up the fierce heat. Then he would let the fire die down to coals. He would do the same in the evening. For the rest of the day and all through the night, the great stone wall did the work. It exhaled a steady, even warmth that kept the entire 400-square-foot cabin at a comfortable, stable temperature. The proof of his success was not in a thermometer, but in the small details of domestic life. The numerical contrast was stark. Inside Matteo's cabin, a steady 65 degrees. Outside, a vicious -17. But the image contrast was what mattered. In Klein's cabin, a tin cup of water left on the floor 3 feet from the stove would develop a skin of ice within the hour. In Matteo's cabin, Elena left her sourdough starter in a ceramic bowl on the broad hearthstone overnight, and in the morning it was alive and bubbling, ready for baking. The air didn't smell of wood smoke and chilled dampness. It smelled of baking bread. His children, Sophia and Leo, were not huddled under blankets. They were playing on a rug on the floorboards in their shirt sleeves. The gentle, radiant heat from the wall creating a comfortable microclimate all around them. The relentless, life-threatening cold that held the entire valley in its grip stopped dead at Matteo Ricci's walls. On the 5th evening of the freeze, Darius Klein was making his rounds through the camp. It was his duty as lead carpenter to check on the integrity of the structures. In truth, he was checking on the people. The cold was taking its toll, morale was low, and sickness was spreading. As he crunched through the hard-packed snow, his face aching from the cold, he passed Matteo's cabin. He stopped, puzzled. There was no smoke curling from the chimney. There hadn't been for hours. The fire was out. A knot of concern tightened in his stomach. With this cold, a dead fire meant a desperate situation. He thought of Ricci's two small children. For all his professional disdain for the man's methods, he couldn't stand by if a family was in danger. He walked toward the cabin, his boots squeaking on the snow, preparing himself for the grim scene he might find inside. As he neared the structure, he passed by the rear, where the great stone wall was partially exposed to the outside. He expected to feel a wave of intense cold radiating from the logs and stone, the signature of a frozen, heatless building. Instead, he felt something else, a gentle, persistent warmth pushing back against the night. He stopped walking, utterly confused. It was impossible. He held up a bare hand, the skin already stinging from the cold air. The warmth was real. He took another step, then another, until he was standing directly beside the granite wall. He reached out and placed his palm flat against the massive stones. They were warm. Not hot, not burning, but radiating a deep, living warmth, like a great beast sleeping. He pressed his back against the wall, the stored heat soaking through his thick wool coat, easing the ache in his frozen muscles. It felt like standing in the afternoon sun, yet the sun had set hours ago, and the world was locked in a deep freeze. Just then, the cabin door opened, and Matteo Ricci stepped out, carrying a small pail. He saw Klein standing there, his hands still resting on the wall. The two men looked at each other in the pale moonlight. There was no triumph in Matteo's eyes, no hint of, "I told you so?" There was only a quiet understanding. Klein finally dropped his hand, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. The carpenter, the man of wood and proven angles, looked from the impossible wall to the quiet stonemason. The foundation of his professional certainty had been shattered by a simple, physical sensation. "You didn't build a wall, Ricci," Klein said, his voice husky with emotion. The words came slowly as he grasped for a metaphor vast enough to describe what he was feeling. "You built a stone glacier that flows with heat." Matteo simply nodded and gestured toward the door. "Come inside. It is cold out." Klein stepped into the cabin and the warmth enveloped him. It was not the dry, scorching heat of a stove, but a soft, pervasive warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And there on the wide hearthstone was the final, irrefutable proof. A small copper kettle, left near the back of the firebox, had a faint, delicate wisp of steam rising from its spout. The fire was nothing but gray ash, yet hours later, the stone still held enough heat to keep water on the edge of boiling. In that moment, Darius Klein understood. The Italian wasn't crazy, he was a genius. The conversion of Darius Klein was more powerful than any argument. He was the camp's foremost expert on building, a man whose opinion carried the weight of experience and respect. When he started talking about the Ricci wall, people listened. He didn't just talk, he acted. As the carpenter for the North Star Mining Company, he had the authority to alter building plans. The new bunkhouse, originally slated for 2 large stoves, was redesigned. Klein himself supervised the construction of a massive stone-backed central hearth, incorporating Matteo's principles. The idea spread like wildfire, or rather like a slow, radiant heat. Miners who had endured miserable winters in the company's shoddy housing began retrofitting their own small cabins. They spent the summer hauling river stones and quarrying rock, building their own, smaller versions of Matteo's thermal battery. By the spring of 1883, more than a dozen cabins in the 2 main mining camp bunkhouses in the district had rebuilt their hearths with heavy stone backing. The results were transformative. Families reported cutting their winter wood consumption by over 60%. The constant, exhausting labor of feeding the fire was reduced to 2 short burns a day. The quality of life. The very possibility of comfort and health in the brutal high-altitude environment had been fundamentally changed by one man's refusal to bow to conventional wisdom. What Matteo Ricci accomplished in 1882 was a masterful piece of intuitive engineering. He had no scientific textbooks, no knowledge of BTUS or thermal conductivity coefficients, but he had a deep, ancestral understanding of materials, an intimacy with stone, passed down through generations of muratori. Without knowing the formal terms, he had built a highly efficient masonry heater, a device that anticipated the core principles of modern sustainable building and passive solar design by nearly a century. Today, architects and builders use sophisticated software to model thermal mass, creating energy-efficient homes with thermal batteries made of concrete, stone, or water. They are rediscovering the profound wisdom that Matteo Ricci carried in his hands, that the best way to fight the cold is not with a constant fire, but with a mass that remembers the heat. The frontier was a place of harsh and immediate memory. It remembered every mistake, every crop failure, every misjudged winter. Survival depended not just on enduring that memory, but on creating systems with a different kind of memory, one that worked in your favor. Matteo's creation was more than a wall. It was a physical archive of warmth. It was a structure that held the memory of the fire long after the flames had vanished, storing the energy of a few hours and releasing it over many. The wall that remembers heat forgets the cold. In its slow, silent, radiant breath, it allowed a family to forget the immediate, biting memory of the frost outside their door. It was the triumph of stored time over an immediate crisis, a testament to the simple, profound idea that the right knowledge, applied with courage, could make even the most unforgiving landscape a place to call home. If you found this story of ingenuity and resilience valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It helps us continue to bring more of these forgotten histories of practical genius to light. We have many more stories to share, and now we'd love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments. What simple, brilliant technology from the past do you think we should bring back into our modern lives? We look forward to reading your thoughts. Disclaimer: the video you have just watched presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Any application of these or similar techniques in a modern context should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.